She found me on a Tuesday, which I only remember because Tuesdays were when the resettlement manifest came through from Central, and I was halfway through a stack of 17 intake forms when she knocked on the open door of my office. I looked up. She was Velthorin. I could tell by the bone ridge coloring along her jaw and the silver-gray undertone of her skin, the kind that shifts toward blue under fluorescent light. Mid-30s, I guessed, though Velthorin aging runs differently than ours. She wore civilian transit clothes, well-maintained but not new, and she held a folded document in both hands the way people hold things they have already decided to use. "Coordinator Rourke," she said. Her standard was formal, careful, with the particular Velthorin register that flattens certain consonants and lengthens the vowels in borrowed words. "I have a proposal. I would like you to read a specific clause of the Compact Civil Union Registration Code before I explain it." I put down the intake forms. That sentence alone told me something. Most people who come to a resettlement intake coordinator with a proposal start with the emotional freight, the situation, the fear, the history, the injustice of it. They lead with why. She had led with the clause. That was either a very practiced legal mind or someone who had learned through experience that leading with why gets you sympathy and leading with the clause gets you the right answer. I had been doing this job for 16 years. I had learned to tell the difference. I gestured at the chair across from my desk. "Sit down." She sat. She placed the folded document on the edge of my desk but did not push it toward me, left it in neutral territory, positioned so I could reach it without her offering it. A considered move. I noticed a small figure in the hallway behind her, pressed against the corridor wall just outside the doorway. A child. Silver-gray skin, a shade lighter than the woman's. Large eyes, gold-green, the particular oversized quality that Velthorin children carry for the first decade before their features settle. She was very still, the stillness of a child who had learned that stillness was useful. "Your daughter," I said. "Sale," the woman said. "She will stay in the corridor. She prefers to observe before entering a space." That also told me something. A child who preferred to observe before entering a space was either a very particular child or one who had learned that new spaces sometimes changed without warning. When you did not know how a space would behave, you watched it first. There was nothing unreasonable about that. It was, in fact, the sensible approach. "I'm Dale Rourke," I said. "Intake Coordinator, Keth Moral Resettlement Center. What's the clause?" She told me. Section 44, Article 9 of the Compact Civil Union Registration Code, the Compact Jurisdiction Sponsor Provision. A registered civil union between a compact citizen and a non-citizen conferred compact secondary jurisdiction status on the non-citizen spouse and any dependent minor children, effective from the date of filing. Compact secondary jurisdiction placed the registered individuals under compact civil law for the duration of the union, and superseded any competing jurisdiction claims from external legal frameworks, provided that cohabitation within a shared residential address could be documented for a continuous period of 60 days from the date of filing. She slid the folded document across the desk. I opened it. It was a copy of the relevant statute, annotated in her own handwriting, Velthorin script in the margins, cross-referenced in blue ink against 2 additional clauses on the facing page. She had drawn a connecting line between the cohabitation requirement in Article 9 and the definition of residential address in Article 3, and another between the jurisdiction supersession clause and its precedent in the 2031 Kethsoral civil dispute. She had read this more carefully than most legal consultants I had dealt with across 16 years of intake processing. The annotations were precise. There were no errors in the citations. One of the cross-references was to a subsection most practitioners did not know existed. "What's the competing jurisdiction?" I said. "Velthorin's Secondary Jurisdiction Clause, Article 7. She folded her hands on the edge of my desk with the careful deliberateness of someone who had rehearsed this conversation and was following her own prepared structure. My husband died 14 months ago. His house, 3rd Velthorin House, Keth Sorrel Line, dissolved in a succession collapse 3 months after his death. The collapse was the result of a disputed inheritance proceeding that I was not party to. Under Velthorin law, a widow whose sponsoring house has collapsed and who has no surviving male line sponsor from an intact Velthorin house loses primary custody of her children to the nearest intact claimant house within 6 months of the house's dissolution. I looked at the statute in my hands. I looked at the child in the doorway. Sale had not moved. She was watching me with those gold-green eyes in the attentive, neutral way of someone who was withholding judgment until she had more information. "How long until the 6 months is up?" I said. 19 days, she said. I read Article 9 again. Carefully, from the beginning, not skimming. The compact civil union jurisdiction provision had been written, I knew from institutional memory rather than from having read it closely before, primarily to protect compact commercial partners from double jurisdiction disputes when they formed business partnerships with non-citizen entities who had family dependents. It had been invoked for domestic protection purposes in the record twice in the last 30 years, both times successfully, both times in situations involving a genuine domestic arrangement. I was not aware of it having been invoked in circumstances like the current ones. The language, however, was broad enough. The language said what it said. The clause requires cohabitation for 60 days, I said. That's the residency requirement for the jurisdiction to hold against a competing claim. Yes. Documented cohabitation at a shared residential address. Yes. So you need a compact citizen willing to file a civil union registration and provide a shared documented residential address for 60 days, after which compact secondary jurisdiction is established by statute, and any pending house petition fails by default. Yes. And you came to me. She looked at me directly. Her eyes were the same silver gray as her skin, very clear, giving away less than the precision of her presentation suggested she was feeling. You have been the intake coordinator at this center for 16 years, she said. Your administrative record shows no disciplinary actions, no procedural violations, no conflicts of interest of any kind on file. You are unmarried and your residential registration lists no dependents. You are the most senior compact citizen currently in residence at this facility's staff housing block. She paused, the pause of someone who was about to say the thing that had actually decided it for her. You also filed an independent welfare inquiry on a Velthorin family in dormitory block C 11 months ago, under your own intake authority, without being asked, and without recording the action in your public log until the inquiry was complete. I remembered that. A family of 4 caught in an automated processing backlog. Their reclassification status had timed out on a technicality during a system migration, and the automated flag had placed them in a return-to-origin queue without reviewing the original asylum grounds. I had been processing a different file when I noticed the discrepancy, read the flagged file out of professional habit, determined that the flag was in error, and contested it under my individual intake authority. It had taken me 3 weeks to get the correction through, cost me a significant portion of my administrative reserve, and required 2 separate appeals before a senior review officer who was not initially inclined to take my assessment of the documentation error on good faith. That was a documentation error that would have resulted in a wrongful transfer, I said. I was the coordinator on duty. It was in my jurisdiction to address it. Yes, she said, but you found it when no one had asked you to look. I set the statute down on the desk. I looked at the child in the doorway again. Sale had moved slightly. She was now half inside the frame rather than fully outside it. Her arms were at her sides. She was watching me with the same careful, withholding attention as before, and I had the distinct impression that the answer I was about to give was being added to whatever catalog she was compiling. "What does the arrangement require from me specifically?" I said. "Shared address documentation for 60 days, beginning from the filing date," she said. "Joint submission of the civil union registration with the Compact Civil Records Office. Availability for any verification inquiry the House claimant files. I expect they will file at minimum 2. Presence at the shared residential address for a sufficient portion of each documented period to satisfy the cohabitation definition under Article 3. She met my eyes. "I am not asking for anything beyond the legal requirements of the statute. I have not asked for anything beyond that in this conversation, and I will not." "I understand that," I said. "I'm asking what you actually need. The legal requirements and what you actually need are not always the same question." There was a pause. It was not a long one, but it was real, and something moved behind that careful exterior. Not much, just enough to confirm that the precision was a structure built over something, not an absence. "Sale needs to remain with me," she said. "That is the whole of it. Everything else in the arrangement, I am prepared to manage entirely independently." I looked at the statute one more time. I looked at the intake forms on my desk. I looked at the child, who had moved another half step into the doorway and was now examining the bookshelves on the left wall of my office, not picking anything up, not touching anything, just looking at the arrangement of volumes with the focused attention of someone conducting an inventory. "The staff housing block has a 2-room unit open in Section C," I said. "I'm in Section B. They're adjacent units with shared corridor access and separate entrances. The Section C unit has been vacant for 2 months. Under the statute's definition of shared residential address in Article 3, which you've already cross-referenced, adjacent units with documented shared corridor registration satisfy the cohabitation requirement." "Yes," she said very carefully, "they do." "I'll file the registration this afternoon," I said. "The Compact Civil Records Office processes same-day submissions if you get there before the 3rd hour. Do you have your full identification documents?" She had them. Of course she had them. She had prepared for this conversation the way I prepared for a complicated intake review, everything organized in the correct sequence, cross-referenced, nothing duplicated, nothing missing, no loose ends. She produced the documents from the bag beside her chair in the order. The registration form required them, and placed each one on the edge of the desk as I reached for it. I filled out the form at my desk while she sat across from me. Sale came fully into the office at some point during the process. I did not see her cross the threshold. I was focused on the form, but when I looked up to confirm a document reference number against the originals, she was standing beside the left bookshelf, examining the intake regulation volumes with her arms folded behind her back, not touching anything. "Those are intake regulation volumes," I said, "2019 through 2024. She looked at me. She did not say anything. Her expression was not unfriendly. It was the expression of someone reserving opinion. "The 2022 edition has an error in Section 14, I said, returning to the form. "The cross-reference on page 341 points to the wrong subsection. I identified it about a year ago and marked it in the margin." I heard the sound of a book being pulled carefully from a shelf. I did not look up. I finished the form. I filed it at the 2nd hour, 40 minutes before the deadline, and the Compact Civil Records Office sent a confirmation number within the hour. I entered it in my administrative log and added a brief notation. "Civil Union registration filed, Article 9 jurisdiction sponsor provision. Standard documentation complete. No conflict of interest. Residential arrangement Section B and adjacent Section C unit. Shared corridor registration filed simultaneously." When I looked up from the log, Sale was standing in front of the bookshelf with the 2022 volume open in both hands, reading. She had found page 341. I could tell because she had stopped and gone back to read the same passage twice, and then she turned to look at the handwritten note I had left in the margin 11 months ago when I first caught the error. She stood there for a long moment. Then she put the book back exactly where she had found it. She left without saying anything. Sarath followed her after a moment's pause at the door. "Coordinator Rourke," Sarath said. "Rourke is fine," I said. She looked at me with that clear, careful expression. "Rourke," she said. She said it as though she was filing it in the correct location. "Thank you." "I filed a form," I said. "Come by tomorrow with the Section C registration papers. I'll co-sign." She left. I looked at the intake form still waiting on my left. I looked at the confirmation number on my screen. I picked up the pen and went back to the forms. The House claimant's first petition arrived at the Compact Civil Records office on the 4th day. I know because Sarath came to my office at the end of the day with a copy of the arbiter's inquiry, which had arrived in her inbox 2 hours before. The inquiry asked me to confirm the registration's validity and provide documentation of the cohabitation arrangement. I confirmed it in writing the following morning, citing Article 9 and Article 3 in full, including the cross-reference subsection most practitioners overlooked. I documented the shared corridor registration, the filing date, the registration confirmation number, and the residential addresses of both units. I wrote clearly. I did not write more than what the inquiry required. Sale came to my office doorway on the 6th morning. I heard her in the corridor before I saw her, a very specific pattern of footsteps, deliberate and evenly spaced, the footsteps of a child who was making a deliberate decision about each one. She stood in the doorway for approximately 2 minutes. I did not look up from my work. Then she came in. She went directly to the left bookshelf. She looked at the 2022 Intake Regulation volume for a long moment, then pulled it out carefully with both hands and carried it to the corner of the office nearest the window, where the light was better. She sat down on the floor, opened it to page 341, and started reading from the beginning of Section 14. She was 6, possibly 7. I did not know how much of Section 14 she could follow. She read it with the complete focused attention of someone who intended to understand it before she closed the book. After some time she found the error. I could tell because she stopped and went back to read the relevant subsection twice, and then she turned to look at my handwritten notation in the margin again. She looked at it for a while. Then she turned back to the beginning of the section and read it through again. After she finished, she put the book back where she had found it. She left without saying anything. She came back the next morning. The 2023 volume came off the shelf. The morning after that, the 2024 volume. By the end of the first week, she had worked through the intake regulation volumes in order and started on the intake processing guides, which were more complex but organized on the same structural logic. I did not tell her to stop. I did not tell her she was welcome either. I was at my desk, I processed forms, I read manifests, I made tea at the second hour in the small electric kettle on the shelf above the filing cabinet. One morning, I filled 2 cups without making a decision about it, set one on the corner of the desk nearest the bookshelf, and went back to the form I was reviewing. When I looked up an hour later, the cup was on the floor beside where she was sitting, and it was empty. On the 11th day, the House claimant filed a secondary petition alleging that the civil union registration was a procedural fabrication, that the arrangement did not constitute a genuine domestic relationship and was being used instrumentally to circumvent Velthorin's secondary jurisdiction. They were correct in their characterization. I did not see any reason to pretend otherwise to myself, nor did the statute require me to. The arbiter's inquiry asked me to provide supporting documentation of the residential arrangement and any evidence of a domestic relationship consistent with the statute's cohabitation requirement. The statute's definition of domestic relationship, I looked it up, referred to documented shared address registration, joint administrative filing, and regular contemporaneous presence at the shared address. It did not define the nature or quality of any interpersonal relationship. It specified documented facts, not internal states. I wrote the response at my desk, while Sale sat cross-legged on the floor beside the bookshelf working through an intake processing guide, and Sareth sat in the chair across from me reading her own copy of the petition and the inquiry. "The petition argues intent," Sareth said. "Intent is not a statutory requirement," I said. "Article 9 specifies documented facts. If the Compact Civil Records Office had wanted to include an intent provision, they would have written one." I reviewed the definition clause again. The documentation satisfies the statutory definition. That's what the arbiter is required to apply. Sareth looked at the inquiry. "They will argue that the arrangement is not genuine." "They can argue whatever they like," I said. "The statute is the statute." I finished the response and filed it before the end of the working day. The second petition was dismissed. On the 14th day, Sareth knocked on my door in the evening. I was still at my desk. The Tuesday manifest had been heavy, and I had stayed late to finish the review. "Sale would like to know," she said, "if you would eat dinner in the shared corridor." I looked at her. "She has determined that the corridor has the best acoustics for a conversation she wants to have," Sareth said. Something in her expression, very controlled, registered as amusement that had long practice at staying contained. "She has been testing the corridor's acoustics for several days." "What does she want to talk about?" I said. "Section 14 of the 2022 regulation volume," Sareth said. "She has questions." I closed the file I had opened. I got up and went to the corridor. We ate in the corridor. Sareth had brought food from the facility cafeteria, plain and practical. Grain rolls, protein portions, 2 kinds of vegetable preparation from the Velthorin line that the facility stocked for the resettlement population. Sale sat across from me on the floor with her own portion and explained, in precise and methodical terms, everything she had concluded about the error in Section 14. She had worked out on her own that the cross-reference problem was most likely a formatting error in the original digital submission to the Compact Procedural Office, not a drafting error in the statutory language itself. Her reasoning, the subsection the cross-reference pointed to, was the one directly below the correct subsection in the original document structure, which meant the formatting template had likely auto-populated the reference number 1 position down from where it should have been when the document was converted for submission. A drafting error would have been more random. A formatting error would have been consistent and directional, which this one was. She was right. That was exactly the conclusion I had reached when I found the error, and I had noted it in the margin in abbreviated form. I had not written out the full reasoning. "You're right," I said. She looked at me with those gold-green eyes. They had not changed their careful, assessing quality in 14 days. "You already knew this." "Yes." "You did not tell me." "You didn't ask," I said. "And you got there on your own. That's worth more than being told." She considered this for a moment, chewing a bite of grain roll with the methodical thoroughness she applied to everything. Then she said, "I would like to discuss Section 7 tomorrow. There is something I do not understand about the cross-reference table in the second appendix." "Come by at the second hour," I said. "I'll have tea ready." She came at the second hour. Tea was ready. She went straight to the cross-reference table in the second appendix of Section 7, and we worked through it for the better part of 40 minutes before she had satisfied herself that the structure was internally consistent, and the thing she had not understood was a genuine ambiguity in the original drafting, rather than a reading error on her part. It was, in fact, a genuine ambiguity. I told her so. She filed that information with the same precise neutrality she applied to everything. Then she went back to the bookshelf and found what she wanted next. This became the pattern. Second hour. Tea. She read or asked questions or worked through a procedural guide on the floor with the focused, uninterruptible attention of someone who had decided this was what the time was for. I processed intake forms. Sometimes we talked through whatever she was reading. Sometimes we sat in complete silence for 2 hours, which she appeared to find neither uncomfortable nor unusual. I found it neither uncomfortable nor unusual either, which was mildly surprising. I had lived alone for 11 years and was accustomed to quiet working in a way that did not particularly accommodate other people's presence. Sale's presence did not require accommodation. She occupied the space she occupied and did not expand into the rest of it. Around the 18th day, she began asking questions that were not about the regulation volumes. They were precise questions, delivered in the same careful standard she used for everything, and they were about the work itself, not the procedural mechanics but the underlying logic. Why did the intake manifest get processed on Tuesdays and not distributed across the week? Why the verification response format required the filing coordinator's name rather than the facility's institutional designation? Why certain documentation errors triggered automatic review flags, while others of apparently equal significance did not? She had been observing the intake process through the window and through the corridor, and she had cataloged the gaps between what the procedure said and what the procedure actually did when run by people with constraints and competing priorities. I answered each question. Some of the answers were simple. Tuesdays because that was when Central's processing cycle released the batch, an inherited scheduling structure that had never been changed because it worked adequately, and no one had a specific reason to revise it. Some of the answers were more complicated. The verification format required the coordinator's name rather than the facility designation, because a 2024 procedural revision had been intended to increase accountability and had been implemented inconsistently. So some forms used the old institutional designation field, and some used the new personal name field, and the result was a hybrid that satisfied neither intention fully. She listened to each answer with the same complete attention. She did not write things down. I had the impression that she did not need to. On the 20th day, she said, "You find errors that other people have not looked at carefully enough, but you do not always report them." "I report them when reporting them will fix something," I said. "The 2022 volume error," she said. "You have not filed a correction notice." "No." She thought about this. She had a way of thinking that was visible, not the performed thinking of someone who wanted you to know they were considering the question, but the actual, slightly delayed processing of someone who was genuinely working through it before speaking. "Is that because you do not think it will fix something?" "It's because filing a correction notice to the compact procedural office requires a formal analysis document," I said, "and I have not yet written the analysis. The notation in the margin is for my own reference. It is not a formal record. If someone else uses the 2022 volume without knowing about the error," she said, "the margin notation does not help them." "No," I said, "it doesn't." She looked at the 2022 volume on the shelf. She looked at me. She did not say anything further, but the quality of her silence on the way out that morning was different from the quality of her silence on the way out every other morning. It was the silence of a conclusion reached. The corridor dinners were Sale's idea, but they became something else over time, a different kind of space from the office, where the work was always present and the silence was always in service of the work. In the corridor the work was still there, but at one remove. She talked in the corridor about things she had already worked through and wanted to test against another person's attention. She told me about the house collapse on the 19th day, not as something she was confiding, but as information she had decided I should have. The Keth Sorrell house had dissolved on a Tuesday. She had asked her mother what that meant, and her mother had explained it precisely, including the custody clause and what it required, and what they would need to do. She had then asked what kinds of people could help, and what would make someone willing to. She explained all of that to you at the time, I said. Yes, Sale said. She said people who do not understand what is happening cannot help fix it. I thought about that for a moment. A woman who had just lost her husband and her house standing in her daughter's room and explaining the mechanism of the custody clause to a 6-year-old. The same logic she had applied to walking into my office with the statute. She was right, I said. Sale looked at the corridor wall. You explain things that way too, she said. When I ask, you give me the actual version, not a simplified one. The simplified version is usually wrong in ways that matter, I said. Yes, she said. Most people do not know that. A pause. Or they know it and think it does not apply to me. Then they have not paid attention, I said. She looked at me for a moment with those gold-green eyes, and something in them confirmed itself. Whatever assessment she had been running since the first day she stood in my doorway, arriving at a provisional conclusion that she was now prepared to act on. She went back to her food. The corridor was quiet, and neither of us had anything else to add to it, which was fine. On the 22nd day, the house claimant filed a third petition, this one arguing a procedural defect in the original registration filing, a technical challenge to the document reference number sequence. The challenge was incorrect. The reference number sequence was valid under the 2028 revision to the filing procedure, which the claimant's consultant had apparently not read. On the 23rd day, I filed the response. Sale had read the petition before I finished my first review of it. She sat in the chair across from my desk, Sarath's chair, which she had begun occupying in her mother's working hours without any particular discussion from either of us, and said, "The reference number argument is wrong. They are citing the 2019 procedure. The 2028 revision changed the sequence format." Yes, I said. Do they know this? Either they don't know it or their consultant made an error, I said. The response is the same. She thought about this. Then she went to the bookshelf and found the 2028 procedural revision supplement and brought it back to the chair and read it through while I drafted the response. When I reached the section addressing the reference number challenge, she placed the supplement on the edge of the desk with the relevant passage open and facing me. The third petition was dismissed. On the 31st day, Sarath came to my office at the end of the working day and sat in the chair across from my desk and said, "I want to thank you for what you have done." I set down my pen. I had been hearing variations of this for 31 days, her precise, formal acknowledgments at the end of each substantive development, each petition dismissed, each verification response filed. They were not insincere. They were the acknowledgments of someone who had learned to thank people efficiently and without burden, because an excess of gratitude made the people who had helped you uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people became unreliable. I filed a registration form, I said, and several verification responses. The statutory work is standard intake processing. You did more than that, she said. I looked at her. The careful exterior was still in place, but I had had 31 days to notice what was behind it, the steadiness of it, the fact that it was not coldness but a structure built to protect something that had been unprotected for too long. 14 months of widowhood in a deteriorating house jurisdiction, managing a succession collapse that had nothing to do with her, protecting a child through 19 months of uncertainty. She had walked into my office with a clause and a folded document because she had learned that leading with the clause got you the right answer. I made 2 cups of tea in the mornings, I said. I answered questions about cross-reference tables. I ate grain rolls in the corridor. None of those are extraordinary things. For sale they are, she said. I picked up my pen again. I looked at the stack of forms. I thought about the 11 months I had spent in the facility before Sale started appearing in my doorway. The morning tea made in a single cup, the intake forms processed in silence, the regulation volumes that had sat on the shelf with their errors unmarked in any document anyone would ever read. "She is a precise thinker," I said, after a moment. "She will be very good at whatever she decides to do with it." "Yes," Sarah said. There was warmth in it, quiet and controlled. "She is." A pause. "She told me last week that she wants to be an intake coordinator." I looked up. "She explained her reasoning," Sarah said. "She said intake coordinators find errors that other people have not looked at carefully enough and fix them, without requiring anyone to acknowledge that this is what they are doing." I looked at the intake forms. I looked at the 2022 volume on the shelf with my notation on page 341. I thought about the correction notice I had been meaning to draft for the Compact Procedural Office for nearly 2 years, the formal submission that would put the error on record and require the revised edition to correct it in the next publication cycle. I had been meaning to write it. I had not written it. "The 2022 volume still needs a formal correction notice submitted to the Compact Procedural Office," I said. "The margin notation is for my own reference. The official record still shows the error as standing. A formal submission requires an analysis document with the full supporting reasoning, not just the correction but the documented evidence for how the error occurred and what the correct cross-reference should be." I paused. "I've been meaning to draft it for 2 years." "She could help you draft it," Sarah said quietly. "She already has most of the reasoning," I said. "She worked it out herself. She'd need to write it up in standard and format it for the procedural office submission requirements. That's a specific format." "I will tell her," Sarah said. She stood. She looked at me for a moment with the same clear, direct look she had given me in the first conversation, but something was different in it now, less guarded, or guarded in a different direction. "Work." "Yes." She also identified a discrepancy in the 2024 volume, she said. "She found it last week and has not told you yet. She said she is saving it until she understands it completely enough to explain it correctly." "She should take her time," I said. "If it's worth finding, it's worth understanding before you report it." Sarah held my eyes for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she left. The 45th day petition arrived on schedule and was the most substantial of the 4. The House claimant had engaged a compact jurisdictional consultant, a credentialed one this time, and the petition ran to 11 pages with 17 cited precedents, 6 of which were directly on point and required careful individual addressing, and 3 of which were plausible enough at first reading that they needed to be taken seriously before being refuted. Sale read it the same morning I did. She sat in her chair and read through it twice, the second time more slowly than the first, making small marks in the margins of her copy with a pencil she had started keeping in the pocket of her jacket sometime in the 3rd week. When she finished, she put the petition down and said, "They cited the Keth-Vorel precedent in Section 4. "Yes," I said. "That was a commercial jurisdiction dispute. It addresses partnership agreements, not civil union registrations." She looked at the petition again. "The jurisdictional language is similar, but the statutory basis is different. The Article 9 sponsor provision was written as an amendment to the Civil Registry Code, not the Commercial Code. The Keth-Vorel precedent applies to the Commercial Code." "Yes," I said, "it does." "So they have cited a precedent that is not applicable to this statute. Either they know it's not applicable and are hoping the arbiter will not notice, or they believe it is applicable and their reasoning is wrong," I said. "The response is the same in either case." She thought about this. "Which do you think it is?" I looked at the petition. "I think they have found a precedent where the language is similar enough that they can make a facially plausible argument, and they are making it, because at this stage of the process they have very little to work with and they are required by their client to try." I paused. "That is not dishonest. It is thorough advocacy. Our job is to respond to it correctly." She looked at the petition for a moment. Then she pulled out the pencil and wrote something in the margin. I did not read it over her shoulder. We worked on the response together over 2 days. She drafted the section addressing the Keth-Voral precedent, writing it first in Velthoran, and then translating it herself into Standard. Her translation was precise and only slightly more formal than necessary. I revised 2 sentences for register and left the substance entirely intact. She also caught a secondary precedent in Section 9 that I had flagged as weak but had not fully analyzed, and she wrote a short refutation of it that was more direct than what I had been drafting. I used her language. I noted in my administrative log that the response was collaboratively drafted. I noted who the second contributor was. The response was filed on the 47th day. The arbiter's decision came back on the 49th. I was at my desk when it arrived in the administrative inbox, and Sarath was in the chair across from me reviewing the standing documentation, as she had been doing every morning for the last week. I read the decision. I read it again. The 4th petition was dismissed. The House claimant's filing standing was exhausted under the statute's petition limit provision. Compact secondary jurisdiction was confirmed effective from the original filing date, with full legal force as of day 61. I turned the screen so Sarath could read it. She read it. She read it a second time. Her face did not change, not really, but something in the set of it did. Some underlying tension that had been present since the first day. She walked through my door releasing by one increment, like a load-bearing member that no longer had to carry the load alone. She looked at the screen for a long time. "It is over," she said. "On day 61, I said. "The civil union registration can be formally dissolved at any point after that. The dissolution filing is straightforward. I can prepare the paperwork." She looked at me. I looked at the desk, at the confirmation on the screen, at the 2 teacups, at the intake forms in their usual stack on the left side of the desk, at the 2022 volume with the notation on page 341, and the 2024 volume that Sale had not yet explained to me, sitting on the second shelf where it had been sitting for the last 2 weeks while she made sure she understood what she had found. "Sarath," I said. "Yes." "The correction notice draft for the compact procedural office," I said. "Sale has been working on the analysis. She has most of it structured. But the submission format for the procedural office requires a specific documentation template that she hasn't encountered yet, and walking through that template is going to take at least another week, probably closer to 2. The office was quiet. In the corridor outside, the facility was going through its late morning movement. Intake families being routed to their dormitory blocks, a transit van arriving at the south entrance. 2 weeks, Sarath said. "I also haven't seen what she found in the 2024 volume," I said. "She said she was saving it until she understood it completely. I think she's close, but she's not ready yet, and I would like to see it when she is." The quiet held for a moment longer. "Rurk," Sarath said. She said it the same way she had said it that first time, filing it correctly, but something in the tone was different now. "I know what the arrangement was," I said. "I know what it was for. I also know that I have been making 2 cups of tea every morning for 39 days, and that there is a pending submission to the compact procedural office that I have been avoiding for 2 years that is now half drafted by your daughter, and that she found something in the 2024 volume that she has not told me yet." I looked at the window. I am a person who finishes what he starts. That is how I have done this job for 16 years. It is not a policy I am inclined to change. When I looked back, Sarath was watching me with an expression I had not seen on her before. She had, across 60 days, shown me precision and control, and the very careful warmth that found its way out when Sale made a particularly good argument about a cross-reference table. This was different. This was not precision or control. It was the look of someone who had been carrying something alone for a very long time, and had not entirely realized until this moment that they were not carrying it alone anymore. The 2024 volume, she said quietly, is on the second shelf. I know where it is. Sale will want to explain it herself, she said. She has been preparing. Then she should explain it at the second hour, I said, when she comes in. Sareth looked at the 2 cups on the desk, at the forms, at the window, at me. I would like to eat dinner in the corridor tonight, she said. There was nothing formal in it. Just the sentence, placed carefully in the space between us the way she placed documents on the edge of the desk in neutral territory, available, not pushed. I have time, I said. She left. I sat with the arbiter's decision on the screen and the quiet of the office and the stack of Tuesday's intake forms that still needed reviewing. I picked up my pen. I went back to work. At the second hour I heard footsteps in the corridor, that particular deliberate pattern, each step a decision. Sale stood in the doorway for the amount of time she always stood in it. Then she came in. She sat in the chair. She reached into the bag she was carrying and placed a sheet of paper on the desk. Her own handwriting, Velthoran notation in careful rows with standard translations in the margins, every reference marked. Her analysis of what she had found in the 2024 volume. She had been building it for 2 weeks and it was complete. Page 407, she said. The cross-reference table in the secondary appendix omits a subsection that exists in the 2022 version. I checked the 2023 version too. It was present in 2022, removed in the 2023 revision, and the removal was not documented in the revision notes. She paused. That is not a formatting error. Someone made a decision to remove it. The revision notes should record that decision, and they do not. I looked at the sheet. I could see the argument laid out, precise and fully supported. That's a more significant finding than the 2022 error, I said. Yes, she said, that is why I saved it. I looked at her. Gold-green eyes, very clear, the same careful non-expression that was not unfriendly but reserved judgment until judgment was warranted. 49 days of observation filed in whatever internal catalog she kept. It's good work, I said. She looked at the sheet of paper. She looked at me. The judgment came through, very slightly, in the way she held herself, acetling, as if something that had been assessed at a provisional value had been confirmed. The procedural office submission format, she said. You said it was specific. I'll show you the template today, I said. It takes some getting used to, but once you have it, the structure is logical. Will the submission require my name, she said, as a contributor? It will require the names of everyone who contributed to the analysis, I said. That's standard. She considered this. My name on a compact procedural office submission, she said, not a question exactly, just the fact placed precisely in front of her to examine. Your name on a compact procedural office submission, I confirmed. Outside the window, the Keth Moral Facility went through its morning. The intake queues moving, the Tuesday manifest being routed, another stack of forms coming into the system that would be on my desk before the afternoon. Somewhere in the building, there were families in the early hours of whatever process had brought them here, paperwork still ahead of them, errors still latent in systems that no one had checked carefully enough. There was always more work than there were people willing to do it slowly and correctly. I refilled both cups. Start at the beginning, I said. Walk me through it the way you would explain it to someone who had not read the file. She did. Her voice was careful and steady and did not waver, the voice of someone who had thought about what she was going to say before she said it, and had made sure she understood it completely before she explained it to someone else. She talked for a long time, and I listened, and I asked questions when I had them, and the morning moved around us the way mornings do, indifferent to whether you have finished what you were doing, but patient enough that if you sit still and work carefully, you usually get there in the end. The 2024 submission would go to the procedural office with 2 names on it. The corridor dinners continued. The correction notice for the 2022 volume was filed at the end of the 3rd week, and the procedural office acknowledged receipt and opened a revision review. Sale received the confirmation notification at the shared corridor address, which was the address on file, and she read it 3 times before handing it to me. Day 61 came and went. The dissolution paperwork stayed in the queue where I had put it, unfiled. Neither of us mentioned it. The forms kept coming in on Tuesdays. There were always errors in the system that someone had to find. There was always, as it turned out, more than enough work for 3 people who were willing to read carefully and finish what they started.